These are the zodiac signs of the 50 states as well as DC and Puerto Rico. Now, if you're wondering how can states have zodiac signs or how do they have astrology, they actually do, and so do countries, so do corporations. The reason being is because I think it's a legal thing that these have to have one moment that they're declared to be an entity. So, as a legal entity, whether you're a state, country, person, you have to have some kind of, declaration of a moment that you come into existence. And so it's really interesting for those, especially astrologers like me that are interested in geography. We can glean a lot of information by looking at the birth chart, so to speak, for countries, corporations, etc. And that's how you can generate a map like this with the zodiac sign of different states. I did want to mention that just like with people, states are not just their sun sign. Just like with people, there's a lot going on in the charts that you can see. There's a full story in the birth chart for each of the states. We're not going to go into that much detail here. We're just going to see the sun sign for each state, but it is just a really quick and easy, fun way to see a little bit of the astrology for each state. So checking out this map, it is color coded. So fire states are different shades of red, earth states are different shades of green, air states are different shades of yellow, and then water sun sign states are different shades of blue. And you may notice that there's actually only 11 signs here, and that's because there are no Libra states, not even one. I found that to be very interesting, and this could be for multiple reasons. I do know that the sun is in its fall position in Libra, so this, in other words, it's a very challenging placement. Libra is a great energy, it's a great sign, but if I was going to make a state or a country, I probably wouldn't have it be a Libra sun either, just for that reason. It is a challenging placement, it's debilitated. That kind of begs the question, why are there Aquarius states then? Because sun is in detriment in Aquarius. I'm not totally sure. I'm not sure exactly the whole process of what determines, what part of the year states come into existence. I do know the White House had an astrologer officially for a long time up until some like relatively recently. So not totally sure, but it's really interesting looking at this map. There's a lot of interesting patterns here. For example, you can see that there are some clusters here. If just looking at the continental United States, there's a huge cluster of water states in the northwestern part of the country. I think this is really interesting, especially considering that it's not dominated by just one water sign. You've got a few Scorpios with Washington, Montana, and Nevada, and then a bunch of Cancer states, Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, and then Nebraska being a Pisces state. But I think it's so interesting how there's these like conglomerates of elemental states that are near each other. There's two more of these that I think are pretty big. We have a whole string of Gemini states going from Arkansas through Tennessee and Kentucky to West Virginia. And then just north of there, there's a huge grouping of fire states as well: New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. I think that's so interesting because I feel like people from that area are kind of fiery. I don't know if that happens to just be a coincidence. We can also see a few smaller clusters. Much of New England is water. New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana are earth signs, and then also Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana are fiery. We can also see that the eastern part of the country is much more fiery. West of the Mississippi, we really just have Missouri as a fire state, and then west of that, there's pretty much just Colorado. Of course, we have to include Hawaii as well, but that would be outside of the continental United States. But really, as far as the western half of the continental United States, it's really just Colorado. So I find this so interesting. The western half of the country is very earthy and watery, with a bit of Aquarius as well. But other than that, no air, no fire. With Colorado, of course, being the one outsider. Okay, so the way this whole breakdown is going to work, I do want to go through all of the states pretty quickly. I don't have the patience to do timestamps for each and every state, so I'm going to break this down into regions. So if you just want to see your state or a couple of different states and what their signs are, please go down to the description and I will have timestamps there for you. All right, so with all that out of the way, let's start with the outliers. So I call these the outliers because they're not easily categorized into regions that, they're outside of the continental United States, basically. These would be Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. Now, starting with Alaska, I did not guess Alaska correctly. It's kind of funny. So when I was looking up the zodiac signs for all the states and making this map, I was doing this with my friend and we were guessing the states as we were going. It was really fun. I almost wish I had made a video of that, but it was kind of a spontaneous thing. But I guess Sagittarius for Alaska. I thought, Alaska's on the frontier. It has a spirit of adventure like Sagittarius. It also has really abundant resources, and there's a theme of abundance with Sagittarius and Jupiter. So I was incorrect, but it also doesn't surprise me that Alaska is Capricorn, because Capricorn is such a independent and private sign, and Alaska is very isolated. It's very kind of independent. Now, this is also really interesting to me because, I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself, but Texas is Capricorn too. Both Alaska and Texas are not only the largest states in the United States, they're also very independent, I think. Texas was its own country for 10 years pretty much. And then Alaska is, of course, very kind of isolated. So these are both really resource rich and independent states that both happen to be Capricorn. So I found that to be really interesting. Next is Hawaii. Hawaii, I did guess correctly. I think this is pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. Hawaii has such a cheerful culture, I think, so warm and friendly and outgoing, so proud. So of course Hawaii has to be Leo. I feel like that makes so much sense. It has such a sunny disposition there. My second guess for Hawaii would have been Pisces. I don't know if Pisces falls in the chart for Hawaii, or what else is going on in Hawaii's chart. I could see a Pisces influence because there's a sort of like spiritual connection, I feel like, in Hawaii, and maybe, I could see Hawaii being of the water element, being, very much literally surrounded by water, and I feel like, people of that culture, there's a connection to spirit and emotion. But Hawaii is not Pisces, it's Leo, and that completely makes sense too. Next would be Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is also Leo. Now, I'm not going to do commentary on each and every state or territory. This would take me way too long. I don't know as much about Puerto Rico, but my friend that I was making this with, he wanted me to include Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is Leo, in case you were wondering. Okay, so next region would be the West Coast. That would be Washington, Oregon, and California. Now here, despite those patterns that I outlined at the kind of beginning of this video, for the West Coast, we do have a little bit of a mix. Washington is Scorpio. This totally makes sense to me. I grew up in Washington, so I know a lot about it. It's pretty much my home state. And I've actually done a full kind of in-depth birth chart reading, so to speak, for Washington State. So if you're interested in that, I will link it above here. But yeah, Washington is Scorpio. This makes so much sense. Not only very literally, Scorpio is a water sign. Washington is not only a coastal state with a lot of islands, but also it's known to rain a lot there, of course. It's known for its kind of gloomy, dreary weather. And Scorpio, I feel like, makes sense for that. Scorpio is kind of a pessimistic sign. In the northern hemisphere, it's kind of a gray time. It's the middle of fall, so that makes a lot of sense. Also, though, Washington is known for its music culture, its artistic scene, its creativity. So Scorpio is a very passionate sign. That makes a lot of sense. Scorpio is very artistic and creative, but also Scorpio has a business mentality to it too. Scorpio is very ambitious, and Washington is known for a lot of like tech companies and large companies that are headquartered in Bellevue or Kirkland, Seattle, etc. So Scorpio for Washington, I feel like completely makes sense. Oregon being Aquarius makes complete sense to me too. It makes so much sense. Portland and Oregon are known for their quirky culture. They're known for being kind of counterculture. So what better sign than Aquarius? I feel like this is very straightforward. Now, a little less straightforward, I think. California is Virgo. Not only is California Virgo, but California is the only Virgo state. Very interesting. This would have been maybe like the last sign I would have guessed, honestly. I would have thought maybe a fire sign like Aries or Sagittarius. Even Leo would make a lot of sense. Maybe Scorpio. Now, I looked into the chart of California, and if you're interested, I can do a full reading for California. I haven't done that as of right now, but for California, it's Virgo Sun, I believe Scorpio Moon. There's actually a lot of Scorpio going on in California's chart. So maybe not what we would have initially expected, and definitely not what I would have expected, but very interesting and very telling. I think California has changed a lot over the decades and over the centuries. And that makes sense too, being a mutable sign. There's a lot of change going on. California has looked many different ways and continues to change a lot. So very interesting. I could talk all day about California's astrology. Really interesting stuff going on there. But yeah, California's a Virgo. Who knew? I think this is especially surprising because California has such a prominent reputation. Now, California does have Leo midheaven, so that kind of makes a little more sense because Virgo is such a kind of reserved sign, a quiet sign, very modest. But California has such a boisterous culture. Everyone around the world knows of California pretty much. So Leo midheaven, that might make sense. There might be other indicators in the chart that would make sense why California is Virgo as well. Next, we go to the region which I call the Western Interior. So that would be pretty much, a lot of these kind of Western, like Rocky Mountain states. Let's start in the northwest corner with Idaho. Um, so I'm actually going to kind of cruise through these. I don't have a lot to say about each and every state, but Idaho is Cancer. So is Wyoming, for that matter. And this is where there's this huge watery conglomerate. I think this kind of makes sense. Montana is Scorpio, and then again, Idaho and Wyoming are Cancer. Nevada next door too is also Scorpio. So these states are kind of more in the northwest. I think there can be a sort of like reserved and reflective thing going on with these northern Rocky Mountain states. I think Nevada is a little bit different. Nevada being Scorpio, that makes a lot of sense because there are definitely some extremes there. A lot of things are legal in Nevada that aren't legal anywhere else, or especially in any other part of the country. Vegas in particular is known for its extremes, and I think people can maybe act in more extreme ways when they're in Vegas. So that makes a lot of sense. Scorpio for Nevada. Idaho and Wyoming being Cancer, I think those make sense too. These are more conservative states, and Cancer is more of a conservative sign. Fun fact, more states are Cancer than any other sign. I think this is very interesting, especially because the United States itself is a Cancer. July 4th is pretty much right in the middle of Cancer. So, really kind of weird coincidence that not only is the country Cancer, but also more states are Cancer than any other zodiac sign. But Idaho and Wyoming, these are kind of more conservative signs. That makes sense. Montana is Scorpio. Utah is Capricorn. I actually guessed this sign correctly for Utah. I thought this was pretty straightforward because Utah is very conservative as well, and Utah is very religious. Capricorn is known to be a pretty religious sign. Not all Capricorns are religious, but I definitely think it's a pattern because Capricorns desire structure, and there's a lot of structure that comes with religion, I think. So, Utah being Capricorn, I just feel like that makes so much sense. And also being more conservative, being a little bit more old fashioned, that kind of comes with these maybe stricter norms or structure of society. So, Utah being Capricorn, I totally guessed that right. Next would be Arizona. Arizona is Aquarius as well. I think something that's shared with all or most of these Aquarius states is that they have some kind of like liberalism focus, and by liberalism I mean like classic liberalism, like libertarian, focused on freedom, independence. I do what I want, and that makes a lot of sense. I think being an Aquarius sign, Arizona has been on the frontier for most of its history, and then now it's a swing state. So Arizona has this kind of sort of independence, I think, about it. It's still a very free state in a lot of ways, I think. New Mexico is Capricorn. I don't know a whole lot about New Mexico, but maybe more conservative. That kind of makes sense. Colorado is Leo. That's sort of interesting. I don't know a lot about Colorado either. I've been to pretty much all the western states except for Colorado and New Mexico, so my knowledge might be lacking there. But let me know if Leo makes sense to you for Colorado. Okay, next we go to the Great Plains, so that's going to be the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. Let's start out with the Dakotas. So that continues this not only watery conglomerate, but also this Cancer conglomerate. Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakotas are all Cancer. I believe North and South Dakota became states at the same time, so that's why they have the same zodiac sign. But still, again, this whole area is a little bit more, maybe old-fashioned, kind of reserved, a little bit conservative. So, Cancer makes a lot of sense for that. And as we get into the Midwest here, this is a really friendly area too. So, makes sense. North and South Dakota are Cancer. Cancer is such a friendly sign, wants to connect to everyone and be friends with everybody. So, Cancer makes a lot of sense for the Dakotas. But speaking of friendliness and all that, Minnesota is Taurus. I think that makes sense too. Cancer and Taurus are both signs that are a little bit conservative, steady. Minnesota is very steady and kind of old fashioned and resistant to change. So that makes a lot of sense for Taurus. And Minnesota, again, is, I think, one of the friendliest states. And Taurus is ruled by Venus. Taurus likes to be friendly and have a good time and be pleasant with everyone. So, yeah, and I'm really not surprised by any of these states in this area here. Iowa is Capricorn. I don't really know what else to say about that. That's interesting, I guess. And then Nebraska is Pisces. That one really surprised me. I figured, Nebraska, like the surrounding states, would be a little bit conservative or old-fashioned, kind of, you know, um, maybe like a humble sign like Virgo, Cancer, Taurus, something like that. I didn't think Nebraska would be such a wild spiritual sign like Pisces, but I haven't looked at the chart, so maybe that has more to say about Nebraska. I'm not sure. Next is Kansas. Kansas is Aquarius. I think that's kind of interesting. Kansas was a frontier state too. I mean, so were all these. Same with Missouri. Missouri is a Leo state. For this region, Oklahoma is Scorpio. Now, this one initially surprised me, but then once I thought about it, I do think it kind of makes sense. Oklahoma has some of the most extreme weather, not only in the country but in the world. It's, the one place in the world where there's the most tornadoes, for example. So I mean, Scorpio kind of makes sense. There's definitely some extremes there. Other than that, I can really only speculate, but I do find that interesting. Okay, next we go to the South. I think this is the largest region that I have by number of states, so I'm not going to list them all. I'm just going to start off with Texas. So Texas, I already talked about. It has a lot in common with Alaska, I think. A lot of state pride, very large state, a lot of natural resources, and it happens to be Capricorn. This makes complete sense to me because Texas, I think, is probably the most independent state, especially historically. I think I may have touched on this, but Texas was an independent country for like 10 years. It was actually officially recognized by France. So Texas has more of a claim of independence, I think, than any other state, since it was pretty much legit its own country for a while. So Capricorn, I feel like makes 100% complete sense for Texas. Next, let's go to Louisiana. Louisiana is Taurus. I think this makes sense. Again, this is a more conservative state, being Taurus. That kind of makes sense. And historically, Louisiana was a place of a lot of wealth. New Orleans was a very large city, relative to anywhere nearby for a long time historically. So I think that kind of makes sense that Louisiana would be Taurus, because Taurus is a sign to me that symbolizes wealth, not only wealth, but also abundance that comes with the Venus rulership and, decadence. And, for a large part of history, that's what New Orleans has been. Arkansas is part of this stretch of Gemini states. And this is really interesting. I don't know the history, if there's maybe a historical reason why Arizona, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia are all Gemini states, but I find that to be really interesting. And really, for that matter, all the Gemini states are clustered between there and Wisconsin. So they're really in a small area of the United States. And again, I don't know if there's a reason to why that is, but I find that kind of interesting. And to be honest, I'm not totally sure why that would be. Is there a kind of quirkiness, a curiosity, a social, aspect of Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia? I'm not totally sure. Maybe one of you can comment and tell me, why would these states be Gemini? I'm honestly not totally sure. Mississippi and Alabama are both Sagittarius. This surprises me a little bit. To be the wild and rambunctious Sagittarius is kind of unusual to me, but these are also southern states. There's that element of like southern hospitality, the friendliness. So I think that could kind of make sense with Sagittarius. Sagittarius is such a warm and gregarious sign, so maybe I could see that making sense. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Next is my current home state of Florida. Florida is Pisces. This one I feel like is kind of obvious. This makes total sense. Florida is known for its kind of crazy, wacky stories, and Pisces is kind of a crazy, wacky sign. Florida also makes sense being a water sign because there's water not only pretty much surrounding it on three sides. Florida is a peninsula, but also it does rain a lot here. There's a lot of storms, there's hurricanes, a lot of watery storms and influences. So that all makes sense. There's a lot of wetlands too. So there's literally water everywhere. Florida is also a very libertarian state, and I think Pisces has an element to it where it can be very spiritual, but it also wants to be very free. It doesn't want to be too tied in or too controlled by anyone. It wants to have room to explore itself. And Florida has, it has so many different aspects to it. Pisces, I feel like makes a lot of sense for Florida. Georgia is Capricorn. I do think this could kind of make sense because Georgia is becoming a more business-oriented type of place. Atlanta is almost like the new Hollywood these days. So, I mean, that could kind of make sense with like the business side of Georgia. I'm not totally sure. Let me know what you think about that. South Carolina is Aries. This one I guessed, and I was actually pretty confident about it too when I guessed it, because South Carolina initiated the secession, the Civil War, and what other sign could that state be other than Aries? Aries is, I think, the only one that would be the most ambitious and the most courageous and bold to start a war like that. So I guess South Carolina was Aries, and I was correct. South Carolina is not only South Carolina Aries, but there are no other Aries states. I find it surprising because I would think you would want Aries states. The sun is in exaltation in Aries, so it's a very strong placement to have. Sometimes Aries has too much energy where it can be out of control, though, so maybe there's some kind of downside there. But yeah, South Carolina is Aries. I feel like historically that makes a lot of sense. North Carolina is Scorpio. Virginia is Cancer, and I forgot to mention this is also part of a kind of watery cluster. As you can see, North Carolina, Virginia, DC, and Maryland are all water signs. DC and the two states surrounding Virginia and Maryland are all three of those are Cancers. I think they may have been formed at the same time, so that could explain why there's such a cluster there. But adding to this cluster is North Carolina being a Scorpio, so we have this kind of watery sort of mid-Atlantic region. I also find this especially interesting because not only is the whole country Cancer, like I mentioned before, but also the capital is Cancer, and the two states surrounding the capital are Cancer as well. So there's this huge Cancerian focus with this country that you can see in multiple ways on this map. Okay, jumping from the kind of mid-Atlantic over again to the Great Lakes, there's not a lot of diversity in these 5 states. Those would be Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. We only have 3 elements going on here. 2 air, 2 fire, and 1 water. Wisconsin is Gemini, so this is kind of unusual. I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense. Gemini is a friendly sign, sort of. It's chatty. Wisconsin is a very friendly kind of area. Michigan is Aquarius. I'm not totally sure how that kind of works, but that's interesting. Illinois and Indiana are both Sagittarius. Let me know what you guys think about that. And then lastly, Ohio is Pisces. Next, jumping back to the East Coast here, DC and the surrounding states are all Cancer, so there's this kind of water grouping on the East Coast. Very interesting, a lot of Cancer stuff going on. But just north of Maryland is a totally different trend. There's this huge cluster of fire signs. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware are all Sagittarius. And then New York is Leo. And I feel like this makes so much sense because people from this area tend to be a little bit fiery and outspoken and very blunt. This totally makes sense for Sagittarius, I think. To me, this Sagittarius focus being in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Delaware makes a little bit more sense than, southern states like Mississippi and Alabama. But Sagittarius is one of those signs that does have multiple sides to it. It can be very friendly and warm, but it can also be just totally blunt and kind of, blasphemous. New York being Leo, I think especially makes sense. I'm not sure about the state as a whole, but New York City especially is really the center of kind of the world in a way. I mean, New York is such an influential city. Historically, I think there's this theme of kind of grandeur and being larger than life, and everything happening in New York, and it's like the center of the world type of thing. So that kind of makes sense being Leo. Okay, now for New England, it's basically all the states northeast of New York. That would be Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Starting off, we do have 2 Earth states, Connecticut and Rhode Island. I think these areas are lucrative for businesses. I don't remember. I know Delaware is, but there could be a kind of financial focus there. That would kind of make sense being Earth signs. Massachusetts is Aquarius. To me, that makes a lot of sense because Massachusetts is very liberal. It's very progressive and quote unquote forward thinking and such. So that kind of makes sense for Aquarius, kind of like Oregon, that makes a lot of sense. And then north of Massachusetts, we just have water signs up there. So again, this is kind of a cluster. Both Vermont and Maine are Pisces, and then New Hampshire is Cancer. This to me kind of makes sense because there's kind of like a hippie vibe to the Northeast. Same with the West Coast for that matter. And both of these areas have a lot of water signs and Aquarius in their nature. So West Coast and the Northeast, very kind of liberal and progressive, and also have a lot of water and Aquarius to them. So that kind of makes a lot of sense. I feel like these signs, are kind of like hippies and they want to be spiritual and but maybe a little bit experimental and radical too, exploring new social movements and things like that. If you stuck around for that whole thing, thank you. I hope this was interesting for you. And I wanted to just run through some numbers for you. So I actually counted because I'm that nerdy. And if you wanted to know the elemental breakdown, there are 13 fire states. And of course, I'm including Puerto Rico and DC for these. 13 fire, 11 earth, 10 air, and 18 water. So there's by far more of a water focus here. So again, that's kind of interesting. Water country, water states. And then breaking it down by sign, there's 1 Aries, that would be South Carolina, 3 Tauruses, 5 Geminis, 8 Cancers, that would be the most out of any sign, 5 Leos, 1 Virgo, that's California, 0 Libras, 5 Scorpios, 7 Sagittariuses, 7 Capricorns. Sagittarius and Capricorn are tied for second most common after Cancer. And then lastly, there are 5 Aquariuses and 5 Pisces. So I hope you found that kind of interesting. I know there's a lot of kind of weird information, and I left a lot of this kind of open to interpretation because, to be totally honest, a lot of these states make sense to me, but a lot of states I may be a little bit less familiar with, or I'm not sure exactly how that sun sign works for them. But let me know if you want me to do a more deeper dive into your state or a certain state, because it would be interesting to see kind of how the birth charts play out for more of these. So for content like this and more, follow my channel if you would like. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.